September 16th, 2006, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Emma Miller, a 21-year-old nursing student, clocked out from her late shift at a diner on Route 30. She never made it home. The next morning, she missed her clinical rotation, her phone was off, and her parents reported her missing. Police found her red Toyota Corolla abandoned at Conestoga River Park. The driver's door was open. The keys sat on the seat. Her backpack with textbooks was inside. Outside, investigators found scattered footprints, a torn jacket with blood. From the first hours, they suspected foul play. Attention quickly turned to her ex-boyfriend, Ryan Mitchell. The two had broken up months earlier, and witnesses remembered heated arguments. Detectives brought him in, tested his car, his apartment, his DNA. Nothing matched. Still, rumors branded him guilty. The case stalled, and for years Emma was another face on a missing persons flyer. It took 16 years before technology caught up. In 2022, genetic genealogy pulled a DNA profile from that torn jacket. The match pointed not to Ryan, but to a neighbor, who had even joined the search parties back in 2006. His name was Paul Hensley. When investigators collected his DNA from a discarded coffee cup, it matched perfectly. Under pressure, he confessed. He admitted to blocking Emma's path that night, to the violent struggle, and to strangling her near the riverbank. By 2023, the trial ended with a guilty verdict: life without parole. For Emma's family, justice had taken almost 2 decades. For Lancaster, the truth was chilling. The man who smiled at neighbors and offered to help fix air conditioners had hidden a terrible crime. This is the story of Emma Miller, her disappearance, the investigation that failed her, and the DNA breakthrough that finally brought the truth into the light. September 16, 2006, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. 21-year-old Emma Miller was a nursing student at Millersville University. She worked nights at a family diner on Route 30 to cover her tuition. That Saturday, her shift ended around 11:30 p.m. Police began searching within hours. That afternoon, they found Emma's Corolla abandoned at Conestoga River Park, less than 3 miles from the diner. The car was parked in a corner of the lot, away from the main path. The driver's door was open. The keys lay on the seat. Her backpack, stuffed with nursing textbooks and notes, was still inside. Nothing appeared stolen. Outside the car, investigators found more troubling signs. In the grass near the lot, a torn jacket lay crumpled, dark stains already dried into the fabric. Blood tests later confirmed it belonged to Emma. Around it, officers noticed scattered footprints pressed into the dirt, leading toward the riverbank. The prints told of a struggle. Detectives quickly ruled out the idea of a voluntary disappearance. Emma had left behind her car, her books, her keys, and even her jacket. None of it matched her character, but, more importantly, the scene itself pointed to violence. From the first hours, the case was treated as foul play. Word spread across Lancaster before the day ended. Residents who had spent weekends fishing or picnicking at Conestoga Park now watched police tape cut across the entrance. Searchlights lit the trees and riverbank as detectives combed the area for any sign of Emma. Helicopters circled overhead while volunteers gathered in shock. By evening, the Miller family's quiet routine had collapsed into chaos. For police, the disappearance became their top priority. For the community, the park that once felt safe had turned into the center of fear. Emma Miller had walked out of her shift as she had so many times before, but within a single night, she was gone. The evidence at the car told a simple but chilling story. Something had happened in that lot, and Emma had not left on her own. Within days of Emma Miller's disappearance, detectives turned their attention to the person they believed had the strongest motive: her ex-boyfriend, Ryan Mitchell. He was 23 years old, unemployed at the time, and still living in Lancaster County. Emma had broken up with him only 3 months earlier, and friends said the split was messy. The conflict circled around Ryan's drinking, his temper, and his lack of direction. Emma had been focused on her studies while Ryan drifted between part-time jobs. To investigators, it was the kind of story they had seen before: a young woman trying to move forward, a boyfriend unable to let go. Detectives began piecing together what they knew. Ryan and Emma had dated for more than a year, but their relationship had soured during the spring of 2006. Friends told police that Emma often complained about Ryan's drinking. She had argued with him at parties, embarrassed when he raised his voice or stormed out. According to one roommate, Emma said she couldn't keep dealing with his outbursts. She ended the relationship in June. But detectives learned that contact between them hadn't fully stopped. A week before Emma vanished, a gas station clerk reported seeing the two arguing in the parking lot. The witness described Emma standing beside her car while Ryan gestured aggressively. He didn't touch her, but the argument drew attention. That account made its way to police after Emma disappeared, reinforcing suspicion that Ryan still hovered around her life. When detectives interviewed Ryan, they pressed him about the night of September 16, 2006. He said he had been at home with his roommate, watching television and drinking beer. He couldn't remember exact times. He couldn't produce receipts or calls to prove his whereabouts. While waiting on results, investigators interrogated Ryan multiple times. He repeated the same story. He was at home, drinking with his roommate. The roommate backed him up, though details didn't always line up cleanly. Still, Ryan insisted he had nothing to do with Emma's disappearance. Detectives pushed hard, pointing out the gas station argument, the timing of their breakup, and the fact that Emma had vanished only a short drive from his apartment. They asked him if he had followed her that night, if his temper had boiled over. Ryan denied it, again and again. Weeks later, the lab results came back. Ryan's DNA did not match the bloodstains on Emma's jacket. The footprints near the riverbank didn't match his shoes. None of the fibers collected from his car or apartment connected him to the scene. It was a crushing development for investigators who had built their case around him. On paper, Ryan had motive, history, and opportunity. But science didn't back it up. Despite this, suspicion didn't disappear. Reporters covering the case called Ryan the prime suspect. Local television broadcasts flashed his photograph alongside Emma's. Stories hinted that he was violent, jealous, and controlling. Police hadn't named him officially as guilty, but the community drew its own conclusions. In Lancaster, whispers followed him everywhere. Ryan tried to keep working, but the pressure mounted. He was confronted in public by strangers who accused him of lying. His neighbors treated him coldly. Families who had once waved in passing now crossed the street. At the grocery store, people stared. One man told him, "We know you did it." Online, the rumors spread even faster. Early internet forums dedicated to missing person cases lit up with speculation. Posters called Ryan a murderer who had outsmarted police. Some said the lab must have made a mistake. Others accused investigators of covering for him. None of it was true, but perception hardened into certainty. Ryan became the villain of Emma's story, even without evidence. Detectives eventually admit. Years later, when the real killer was identified, detectives and commentators revisited this early stage of the case. They described it as a textbook example of first suspect syndrome. The rush to judgment against Ryan had blinded investigators to other possibilities. By focusing so narrowly, they allowed the actual perpetrator, a man with no criminal record who even volunteered in search efforts, to remain invisible. Ryan Mitchell's story is a reminder of how dangerous it can be when suspicion turns into certainty without proof. He was never convicted of anything. He was never formally charged. But in the eyes of the public, he was guilty for years. His life fell apart not because of what he did, but because of what people believed he had done. The tragedy of Emma Miller's case was compounded by this mistake. A family was left without answers. A community was left fearful. And an innocent man bore the weight of accusations he could never escape. Meanwhile, the real killer continued living among them, unsuspected, unpunished, and free. The early investigation into Ryan Mitchell shows how fragile justice can be. Evidence matters, and when investigators ignore it or cling to assumptions, lives are destroyed. For Ryan, the suspicion never fully disappeared. For Emma, the truth remained hidden for 16 long years. And for the community of Lancaster, trust in the investigation began to erode before the case even went cold. By the end of 2006, detectives had exhausted leads against Ryan. With no match to DNA and no physical link to the crime scene, they had no choice but to pull back. Emma's disappearance became another entry in the growing stack of cold cases. The Miller family was devastated. Ryan's life was in ruins. And the person truly responsible was still out there, hiding in plain sight. This chapter of the investigation stands as a warning. In the desperate search for answers, police and communities often seize on the most obvious suspect. But when the obvious answer is wrong, the cost is devastating. It cost Ryan Mitchell his reputation, his home, and his future. And it cost Emma Miller 16 years. The community rallied. At Conestoga Park, where her car had been found, a candlelight vigil drew hundreds. Students from Millersville University stood alongside church members, neighbors, and co-workers from the diner. They carried flyers with Emma's face, passed candles from hand to hand, and prayed she would come home. For a moment, the entire town seemed united in grief and determination. Media coverage was relentless. For weeks, Emma's disappearance led the nightly news. Radio stations ran hourly updates. Her photo stared from missing posters taped to storefront windows, bus stops, and telephone poles. Lancaster was a small community, and people felt her absence in every corner. Fear began to take hold. Young women stopped walking alone at night. Co-workers arranged rides after closing shifts. Parents warned their daughters to stay away from Conestoga Park. The quiet town changed its routines overnight. As weeks stretched into months, rumors filled the silence left by unanswered questions. Some pointed fingers at Ryan Mitchell, the ex-boyfriend who had already been scrutinized by police. Others claimed to have seen strangers lurking near the park. Online forums amplified speculation, blending fact with rumor until truth became hard to separate from gossip. For the Miller family, every headline and whisper cut deeper, because none of it brought Emma home. Meanwhile, volunteers searched relentlessly. Groups of neighbors and college students walked the fields, riverbanks, and wooded areas around Lancaster County. Flyers were handed out at gas stations and grocery stores. Church groups organized food drives to support search teams. The community worked hard, but each effort ended the same way, with no trace of Emma beyond the items found at her car. The toll on the Miller family grew unbearable. Linda withdrew, unable to face the constant reminder of Emma's absence. She rarely left the house. Thomas buried himself in action, visiting the police station daily, pressing for updates, calling detectives, asking what else could be done. Their grief showed in different ways, but both lived under the same weight. A daughter gone, a silence that deepened with every passing day. By late 2006, public attention, the Millers refused to accept silence. They began writing letters to state and federal officials, urging more resources for unsolved disappearances. They spoke at town meetings, reminding Lancaster that Emma was not just another missing person statistic. They insisted her name remain alive in the community. Each year, on September 16th, they returned to Conestoga Park to hold a vigil. In the early years, the events drew crowds of students and residents, but as time passed, attendance declined. By the late 2000s, the vigils were smaller, sometimes no more than family, close friends, and a few determined supporters holding candles in the dark. Still, Thomas and Linda continued. For them, the vigil was a promise that Emma would not be forgotten. By then, Emma's name had almost disappeared from the news. Local stations mentioned her only in brief anniversaries. For much of the community, life had moved on. Emma became another cold case, her file sitting in storage, her story mentioned only occasionally in conversations. Yet for her parents, the pain never dulled. Every year without answers reopened the wound. Lancaster carried on, but the Millers lived, frozen in the moment Emma vanished. They saw classmates graduate without her, friends marry, families grow. Emma's absence was a permanent shadow in their lives. What had once been a public tragedy slowly turned into a private burden, carried by a family determined to keep her memory alive in a world that seemed to have moved on. Part 3 of Emma Miller's story is not about breakthroughs or evidence. It is about the silence that follows when cases grow cold. It shows how quickly a community can rally and how just as quickly attention fades. It shows the loneliness of families left behind, fighting to hold on to hope when the world has already let go. By 2022, Emma Miller's case had been unsolved for 16 years. Her file sat in the cold case unit of Lancaster County, officially marked inactive since late 2006. Detectives who had once walked the riverbank and interviewed witnesses had retired or moved on. For years, the only thing the Miller family received were polite updates with detectives pulled Emma's case file and re-examined the evidence. The torn jacket found near her abandoned car had been stored for more than a decade and a half. In 2006, analysts had tried to test the blood on it, but the DNA was too degraded to build a usable profile. At that time, technology couldn't process tiny or damaged samples. In 2022, labs had new tools. Advanced sequencing methods allowed forensic scientists to pull usable genetic material from samples once considered worthless. They carefully cut fibers from the jacket and extracted the dried blood. Piece by piece, they rebuilt enough of a DNA profile to move forward. The profile was uploaded into a national genealogy database used by law enforcement. Analysts began scanning for potential relatives. The process didn't produce direct suspects. Instead, it generated leads in the form of distant cousins or extended family who had submitted their own DNA for ancestry purposes. Then came the breakthrough. A hit appeared. A distant cousin living in Ohio. This person had no known connection to Emma Miller or Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But genetically, they shared common ancestors with the person who left their DNA on Emma's jacket. From there, genealogists went to work. They built out the cousin's family tree, adding branches through marriage records, census data, obituaries, and birth certificates. It was slow, careful work, but each branch led them closer to Lancaster County. Eventually, one line of the tree circled back to Pennsylvania, close to where Emma had lived and disappeared. The investigators narrowed their focus. Within that branch, one man fit the right profile. He had been in his late 30s in 2006. He lived near Emma's apartment at the time of her disappearance. He matched the age, the location, and the opportunity. His name was Paul Hensley. Hensley was now 54 years old. He worked as an HVAC technician, repairing heating and cooling systems in homes and businesses across the county. On the surface, he looked ordinary. He had never been arrested. He paid his bills, attended local events, and was remembered by some neighbors as helpful. The results were undeniable. The DNA from Hensley's discarded coffee cup matched the DNA extracted from the blood on Emma's torn jacket. Not a partial match, not a possibility. A direct, perfect match. 16 years after Emma disappeared, investigators finally had their suspect. The lab confirmation was the turning point. For years, the case had been driven by theories, suspicions, and speculation. Now, detectives had physical evidence tying a real individual to the scene of Emma's disappearance. After nearly 2 decades of silence, the investigation moved forward with certainty. For the Miller family, the call from detectives was both shocking and overwhelming. After years of unanswered questions, they finally had a name they had never heard before. It wasn't Ryan Mitchell, the ex-boyfriend who had carried suspicion for so long. It wasn't a stranger who passed through town. It was someone from their own community. A man who had once stood beside them during searches. The announcement of the DNA match spread quickly through the department. For investigators who had carried the weight of the cold case for years, it was a moment of relief. The science had spoken clearly. After so much time, Emma's story would finally move toward answers. The breakthrough also reignited public interest. When news of the DNA hit leaked to the press, residents of Lancaster reacted with shock. Many remembered Hensley as a technician who fixed air conditioners, or as the neighbor who waved while walking his dog. To learn that he had lived among them for 16 years, while carrying the secret of Emma's disappearance, sent waves through the community. But before police could make an arrest, they needed to prepare carefully. They reviewed every detail of the case. They rechecked the chain of custody for Emma's jacket, ensuring the evidence would withstand defense scrutiny. They documented every step of the genealogy research. They prepared search warrants for Hensley's home, his vehicle, and his devices. The case had taken 16 years to reach this point. They could not afford mistakes now. Behind the scenes, genealogists and detectives reflected on what had been achieved. Without the state's decision to fund genetic genealogy, Emma's case might have remained unsolved forever. Traditional investigation had exhausted its leads long ago. Ryan Mitchell's name had been cleared, but his life had been ruined. The true perpetrator had walked free for years, and it took science, applied at the right moment, to break through the silence. By early June, 2022. Everything was in place. Detectives had their suspect. They had their DNA. They had the legal grounds to move forward. Emma Miller's case was no longer just a cold file. It was alive again, armed with evidence that could not be denied. This was the turning point of the story. 16 years of frustration, grief, and unanswered questions led to one clear conclusion. Paul Hensley was the man tied to Emma's disappearance. And with that confirmation, the stage was set for his arrest. On the morning of June 10, 2022, police units rolled quietly into a quiet Lancaster neighborhood. Their target was the home of 54-year-old Paul Hensley. For weeks, investigators had been preparing. They had DNA, they had surveillance, and they had warrants in hand. At sunrise, officers moved in. Within minutes, Hensley was led out in handcuffs. Neighbors stood in stunned silence. Some filmed the scene on their phones as Hensley, wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt, was placed in the back of a police cruiser. His face showed no panic, no tears, just a flat expression. For those who lived nearby, it was almost impossible to believe. One neighbor, watching from her porch, whispered, "He fixed my AC last summer. I never thought it was him." The charges were read clearly: first-degree murder and kidnapping in the disappearance of Emma Miller. For the Miller family, those words brought a flood of emotion. For the first time in 16 years, they heard a name tied directly to their daughter's death. Shockwaves spread instantly through Lancaster. Hensley was not an outsider. He was the man people trusted to repair their heating units, to wave hello in the morning, to volunteer at community events. Even more disturbing, records showed he had joined the search for Emma back in 2006. He had walked side by side with neighbors, handed out flyers, and even spoken with Emma's parents. The revelation that the helpful neighbor had been the killer all along felt like betrayal. Thomas and Linda Miller remembered those early days vividly. They had thanked Hensley personally for helping distribute flyers. Now they were forced to face the truth that the man they had once welcomed into their search was the same man who had stolen their daughter's life. The discovery left them devastated, caught between relief at finally having an answer and horror at what that answer meant. News of the arrest traveled fast. Local papers ran front-page headlines. Cold case solved after 16 years by DNA. National outlets followed within hours. NBC, CNN, and ABC all covered the arrest, calling it a landmark example of the power of genetic genealogy. Viewers across the country were introduced to Emma's story for the first time, while those in Lancaster relived the case they had never forgotten. Commentators immediately criticized the early investigation. Legal experts noted how detectives in 2006 had zeroed in on Ryan Mitchell, the ex-boyfriend, while failing to properly examine others in Emma's circle. The new evidence exposed what many called tunnel vision, a mistake that had allowed Hensley to go unnoticed. Analysts asked how someone living only blocks away from Emma's apartment, with access to the park where her car was found, had avoided serious scrutiny. The press pressed hard with uncomfortable questions. How did a man with no criminal record manage to hide such a violent crime for 16 years? How many more cases like Emma's were buried in dusty files, waiting for new technology to bring the truth to light? For families of other missing persons in Pennsylvania, Emma's case became a rallying point. Parents and siblings of cold case victims demanded genetic genealogy testing in their loved ones. The case also triggered a national debate. Civil liberties advocates raised concerns about privacy in genealogy databases. warning of potential overreach. But for most in Lancaster, and especially for the Miller family, the argument was clear. If DNA technology could solve cold cases, it had to be used. The Millers, standing before cameras once again, expressed their complex emotions. 16 years of waiting had ended with the name of a man they had never suspected. They admitted to feeling shattered by the betrayal, but also a small measure of relief. At last, they could put a face to the darkness that had haunted them since 2006. Media outlets followed every development. Television trucks lined the courthouse steps. Reporters filled the evening broadcasts with clips of Hensley being escorted by deputies, his face impassive, his hands chained. Analysts framed the arrest as not just the closure of a single case, but a milestone in the fight against unsolved crimes nationwide. In Lancaster, the arrest changed the atmosphere overnight. For 16 years, Emma Miller had been a name tied to an unanswered question. Now, the answer was public, and it shook the town to its core. Friends who had once exchanged greetings with Hensley avoided even saying his name. Former customers cut ties with his business. His identity shifted instantly from trusted neighbor to convicted predator. For the Miller family, this stage of the journey was painful but essential. After years of silence, they finally knew who had taken their daughter. The arrest did not heal the wound, but it gave them a path toward justice. The significance of June 10, 2022 was not lost on anyone. A case once frozen in the cold files had returned to life. A suspect had been named, charged, and exposed. And Emma Miller's story was no longer one of silence. It had become one of answers, accountability, and the start of a reckoning. This was the turning point. From this moment forward, Emma's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a criminal case, ready to be prosecuted. They let the denial sit a while. Then they walked him through the evidence. They reminded him of the torn jacket recovered in 2006 near Emma's abandoned car. They explained how the blood on the fabric had been tested with old methods and yielded almost nothing. 16 years passed. New technology changed that. In 2022, the lab extracted a partial profile, and genealogists traced it to a family branch that led straight back to Lancaster. Surveillance teams watched him for weeks. When he tossed his coffee cup, they collected it. The lab matched that DNA to the stain on Emma's jacket. It was his. He stared at the table. He said the lab was wrong. He said the jacket could have been contaminated. He said someone was out to get him. The clock ticked. The camera stayed on. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten him. They moved slowly, one verified fact at a time. His job sites in 2006 placed him in the same corridor as Emma's apartment. His vehicle at the time was registered to an address less than a 10-minute drive from the park. His cell phone records from that year were incomplete, but the tower logs that survived showed pings along the Route 30 stretch late at night. He still called it a coincidence. They showed him photographs from 2006. The Corolla in the lot, the driver's door open, the keys on the seat, the backpack on the floorboard, the strip of grass where the jacket lay, the partial shoe marks pressed into the dirt, some overlapping, some angled toward the riverbank. He looked away. He asked for more water. He rubbed his temples and said he had a headache. Detectives let the silence do some work. Then they brought in the lab report, the DNA sequence from the cup, the sequence lifted from the jacket, the comparison charts, the probability statement. The conclusion line in bold: match. He kept quiet long enough that the recorder picked up only the hum of the ventilation and the click of the clock hand moving forward. Hours passed. They stepped out. They stepped back in. They asked the same questions, but smaller now, more precise. They asked him what he saw. He said he saw a young woman near her car. He said he thought she looked upset. He said he told her to take a walk to clear her head. She said no. He moved in front of her. He thought she would listen if he blocked her path. She tried to go around. He grabbed her arm. She pulled away. He grabbed harder. The room stayed still while he talked. He said there was yelling. He said she pushed him and he lost his balance. He said she scratched at his hands and face and he flinched and jerked his arm. He said her jacket tore. He said he remembered the sound of fabric ripping. He noticed blood on the sleeve and on his knuckles. He said he didn't know whose blood it was and he didn't care in that moment because everything was moving fast and nothing felt real. Detectives asked him to explain the footprints. He said they stumbled over the edge of the grass, out of the even ground and into the rougher strip where the soil stayed damp at night. He said he pulled her back by the shoulders and she fought like she was carrying to break rope. He used the word fight twice and then stopped himself. He said she was frantic. He said he was trying to calm her down. He said when she tried to scream again, he put his hand on her throat to keep her quiet. They didn't interrupt. He kept going. He said he didn't plan anything. He didn't lure her. He didn't follow her from the diner. He said he was drunk and angry and tired of being told no. He said he pressed harder because he was afraid someone would see them or hear them. He said it took only seconds before she stopped moving. He didn't know what to do next. He took his hand away and she didn't respond. He shook her shoulder. Nothing. The next part came out in pieces. He said he dragged her toward the riverbank because the lot felt exposed. He said the slope down to the water was slick and he had to brace his heels in the dirt to get leverage. He said the reeds by the edge made a kind of screen. He pulled her into that cover and left her there. He wiped his hands on his jeans. He walked back to the car, looked inside at the backpack and the keys, and backed away. Detectives asked him where he placed her body exactly. He described the angle of the lot to the water, the worn path cut by fishermen, the rough lip of soil where the grass gave way to mud, the stand of cattails that rose waist-high in late summer. He said there was a concrete block half buried near the edge with rusted rebar showing. He had pulled her just beyond that point, into a pocket where he thought no one would look at night. He didn't move her again. He didn't return. He didn't check. He didn't care. They pressed him on the jacket. He said that during the struggle his hand caught the seam and ripped it. He said he felt something warm on his fingers, blood, and wiped it off without looking. He said he later noticed a cut along one knuckle. That small detail, the shallow knuckle cut, matched a faint quantity of his own blood in the stain pattern on the fabric. The lab had already identified a mixture consistent with Emma and an unknown male. Now the unknown male had a name. They asked him why he kept calling it a misunderstanding. He said he didn't wake up that day planning to kill anyone. He said he had made a mistake. He repeated the phrase like it would reduce the weight of what he'd said. The detectives let him talk because every repetition drew a tighter circle around his own words. A mistake doesn't leave a young woman face down in the reeds. A mistake doesn't end with a family waiting 16 years for an answer. Throughout the interview, he never cried. He never asked about Emma's family. He never asked what would happen to him. He wanted to know why they had kept the jacket for so long, how the science worked, whether they could have done this 10 years earlier. He sounded more curious than concerned. When they played back a few minutes of the recording for him, he listened without emotion and nodded at the parts where he confirmed the struggle and the strangulation. He refused to use the word kill. Detectives built a timeline from his statements. He arrived at the park sometime after 11:45 p.m. He saw Emma near her car. The confrontation lasted minutes, not seconds. The torn jacket, the spattered blood, and the overlapping prints aligned with that duration. He dragged her toward the river, roughly 15 to 20 yards from the parking line. He left. At the close of the session, he agreed to a written statement. He initialed each page. He affirmed that he had been treated fairly and that he had understood his rights. He affirmed that no one had promised him anything in exchange for confessing. He signed. The recorder captured the scrape of the chair as he stood. When the Miller family was notified, they didn't get the transcript first. They got the summary. He had admitted to approaching Emma in the lot. He had admitted to blocking her path. He had admitted to the struggle and to strangling her. He had admitted to dragging her toward the riverbank and leaving her there. There was no apology in his words. There was no expression of regret. Thomas and Linda listened until the end and then sat in silence. 16 years had passed. The truth was clear now, and it was as blunt as the evidence that proved it. Investigators moved quickly to verify every element they could. Forensic teams returned to the park to recheck the terrain markers and confirm the old diagram measurements. They reviewed chain of custody logs for the jacket to ensure the defense could not claim contamination. They secured the audio and video of the confession with multiple copies and locked the originals. They documented his mention of the rebar spike and the precise position of the reeds on the 2006 map. They assembled the corroboration list, each detail he provided, the corresponding report or photograph, and the notation that those facts had never been released publicly. The confession didn't end the case. It anchored it. Combined with the DNA match and the original scene evidence, it gave prosecutors a direct line from the lot to the defendant. It explained the torn jacket. It explained the blood. It explained the shoe marks that broke away from the pavement and into the grass. It explained why Emma never made it home. Hensley spent that night in a holding cell. He asked for a lawyer the next morning. The request was granted and all questioning stopped. It didn't change what had already been recorded. The statement stood. The science stood. The timeline stood. For the community, word of the confession came later, in careful language at a press conference. Reporters asked about 16 years after Emma Miller's disappearance, the last missing piece was finally on record. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a man in a gray interview room, confronted with evidence he couldn't outrun, choosing to describe the worst minutes of his life and the last minutes of hers. The case that had started with an open car door and a torn jacket now had the words that matched the scene. From that point forward, the investigation moved from suspicion to certainty, from cold file to courtroom. And for the Miller family, the truth, spare, factual, irrefutable, was the only thing left to carry into trial. The confession of Paul Hensley spread through Lancaster like a shockwave. Within hours of the announcement, local news stations broke into programming, national outlets picked up the story, and social media filled with headlines about the man who had lived among them for years. The words were repeated everywhere. Justice delayed is justice denied. Crowds formed outside the courthouse the very next morning. People carried signs, demanded answers, and shouted at officials walking in and out of the building. For many, the outrage came not only from the crime itself, but from the 16 years it took to solve it. Parents held their children closer, angry that a man who joined their search parties back in 2006 had been the killer all along. At Millersville University, students organized their own response. Hundreds marched across campus, carrying candles and banners, demanding more funding for cold case units. They spoke about Emma as one of their own, and about the risk that other unsolved cases would fade away without renewed attention. Professors joined them, saying the state needed to invest in the tools that had finally cracked Emma's case. Forensic experts stepped into the conversation. On television and in print, they emphasized that Emma's case was a clear example of why genetic genealogy mattered. The technology had turned a jacket that once seemed useless into the key to unlocking the truth. Specialists explained that the blood sample collected in 2006 would never have led anywhere with older methods, but with advanced sequencing, it exposed the man who thought he had gotten away. Commentary turned quickly to the mistakes of the past. Columnists asked. The Miller family stepped forward once again. Thomas and Linda Miller spoke to cameras outside their home. They thanked investigators who never gave up, but they also called for reform. They demanded stronger procedures for preserving evidence and wider access to DNA technology for law enforcement. Their words carried weight, not just because of their loss, but because they had been the face of persistence for 16 years. The case ignited a national debate. In living rooms and legislative halls, people argued about the balance between DNA privacy and public safety. Civil liberties groups warned about the risks of expanding government use of genetic databases, but families of missing persons countered that these tools saved lives and delivered long-delayed justice. One commentator summed it up simply: if this technology had been used earlier, Emma Miller might not have been just another name in a cold case file. Politicians felt the pressure. Pennsylvania lawmakers faced rallies, petitions, and constant calls from their constituents. Within weeks, new bills were introduced to increase funding for cold case investigations and hire more forensic specialists. The blend wasn't just about Emma anymore. It was about the hundreds of unsolved cases sitting in evidence rooms across the state. Community groups also mobilized. Nonprofit organizations launched fundraising campaigns to pay for additional DNA testing in older cases. Flyers and donation links circulated online. Local churches, universities, and civic clubs joined the effort, turning Emma's story into a movement that reached far beyond Lancaster. The impact rippled outward. Families from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states came forward, sharing their own stories of loved ones who had disappeared. They pointed to Emma's case as proof that hope should not die with time. Some traveled to Lancaster to stand with the Millers at vigils, adding their voices to the demand for reform. In Lancaster itself, emotions remained divided. Many residents felt a sense of relief that Emma's killer had been identified and that the family finally had answers. But others carried deep anger. 16 years of waiting. 16 years of false suspicion. In February 2023, after 16 years of waiting, the case against Paul Hensley finally entered a courtroom. The Lancaster County Court was packed from the moment doors opened. Reporters filled the first rows with notebooks and cameras. Local residents arrived early, some lining the walls because the seats were gone. Former classmates of Emma Miller took their places, some carrying photos of her from college. At the center sat the Miller family. Thomas and Linda, their faces drawn from years of loss, gripped each other's hands as the trial began. Security officers lined the aisles. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the weight of a case that had haunted the county for more than a decade. The prosecution moved quickly to outline its case. Their strategy was built on three unshakable pillars: the DNA match, the confession, and the physical evidence recovered in 2006. The jury was told this case was not about speculation or rumor, but about facts anchored in science and admissions from the defendant himself. The lead prosecutor explained how advancements in genetic genealogy had reopened a file that once seemed hopeless. He described the torn jacket found near Emma's car, preserved for 16 years, and how new sequencing technology pulled a DNA profile from stains once considered too degraded. That profile led directly to Hensley. From the opening statement, the prosecution emphasized one line: "The DNA on Emma Miller's jacket belongs to Paul Hensley. Science does not lie." Witnesses followed. Detective Sarah Klein, the officer who helped push for the new genealogy program, walked the jury through the process. She explained in clear language how a distant cousin in Ohio provided the genetic clue that built a family tree pointing back to Lancaster. Jurors leaned forward as she detailed how surveillance and discarded evidence confirmed the match. Detective Robert Hale, who had worked the case since 2006, spoke with quiet authority. He admitted early mistakes, the years of frustration, and the moment in 2022 when the test results landed on his desk. His testimony carried the weight of someone who had waited all. The defense tried to dismantle the case. Hensley's attorney argued that the confession was coerced. He told jurors that his client had been questioned for hours, worn down, and that he simply repeated what investigators suggested. He reminded the jury that Emma's body had never been found. Without a body, he argued, the story remained incomplete and unreliable. He also tried to undermine the genetic genealogy process, raising questions about privacy and the possibility of mistakes in building family trees. "This is new science," the defense warned. "It is not infallible." Cross-examinations were tense. When Detective Klein was pressed on privacy issues, she replied firmly, "We didn't invade anyone's rights. We followed the law, and the DNA led to one man, this man." When the defense suggested that Hensley's confession lacked credibility, prosecutors countered by showing how his statements matched details only the killer could know: the location of the torn jacket, the pattern of footprints, and the way the body was dragged toward the riverbank. The prosecution's rebuttal was sharp. "Science does not fabricate evidence," the prosecutor said. "DNA connects him. His own words confirm it. This case is as certain as it gets." Photographs of the blood-stained jacket were projected on the screen. The jury saw the rips, the dark spots, and the chain of custody that preserved it through years of storage. Diagrams of the park lot and riverbank were laid out, showing how every element tied back to Hensley's account. Throughout the trial, Hensley sat motionless. He rarely looked up, never showed emotion, and avoided eye contact with the Miller family. Reporters described him as cold, almost indifferent, even as evidence mounted against him. That silence and lack of reaction left an impression on those watching. For the Miller family, it deepened the pain. After several days of testimony, closing arguments arrived. The prosecution told the jury that while Emma's body was never recovered, the evidence was overwhelming. They repeated the three pillars: DNA, confession, and physical proof. They asked jurors to focus on the facts, not on doubts planted by a defense grasping at shadows. The defense repeated their claim of coercion, emphasized the conviction was described as a landmark for Pennsylvania. Commentators called it one of the most important cold case trials of the decade. It validated the use of genealogy testing in court and set an example for other states. Forensic experts praised the work of detectives who preserved evidence long enough for technology to catch up. Families of other victims in unsolved cases saw hope in the verdict. For the Millers, the verdict closed one chapter of a nightmare that had consumed their lives. It did not bring Emma back, but it gave her name justice. Standing outside the courthouse, Thomas Miller told reporters, "We waited 16 years for this moment. Now the world knows who took our daughter from us." The trial of Paul Hensley proved that even the coldest cases can find resolution. It showed the power of evidence preserved, the reach of new science, and the determination of investigators who refused to quit. The verdict was more than just a legal outcome. It was a statement that Emma Miller's story would not be buried in an old file. It was proof that justice, though delayed, had finally been delivered. The trial ended in 2023 with a life sentence for Paul Hensley. For the Miller family, it was a verdict they had waited more than 16 years to hear. But even with justice delivered, the community of Lancaster was left to process the scars the case had left behind. In the weeks after the verdict, Lancaster began to move forward. Shops reopened to their normal pace, students returned to campus, and headlines slowly shifted to news stories. But the name Emma Miller did not fade. For many residents, the case remained part of their daily conversations. People who had joined the search efforts back in 2006 still carried vivid memories of the nights combing through fields, stapling flyers to utility poles, and holding candles in the park. They spoke of relief that the truth had finally come out, but also of sadness that it had taken so long. Conestoga River Park, once the site of flashing police lights and crime scene tape, changed meaning for the community. A place once marked by fear became a point of remembrance. Visitors walked by quietly, some leaving. The family also chose to place a memorial stone in Conestoga Park. It was simple, but powerful. The inscription read, "Justice may be delayed, but never forgotten." For those who read it, the words became a reminder that answers can surface even after decades of silence. The legal and scientific impact of the case extended far beyond Lancaster. Forensic training programs across the United States began using the Emma Miller file as a teaching model. It showed how preserved evidence, even when degraded, could later unlock the truth with advanced DNA sequencing. Detectives from other states studied the case to understand the mistakes made in 2006, particularly the tunnel vision that focused too heavily on Ryan Mitchell. Law enforcement leaders began updating their protocols to ensure that suspects would not be prematurely branded without supporting evidence. In Pennsylvania, the state legislature acted quickly. Lawmakers approved new funding to expand cold case units, adding more investigators and investing in cutting-edge forensic technology. The Emma Miller case was cited directly in debates on the floor of the state capitol. Representatives argued that the cost of inaction was far higher than the cost of testing because each unsolved case left families in limbo and killers free to walk the streets. The case also created ripples among families of other missing persons. Parents who had waited years for answers saw hope in Emma's story. Advocacy groups organized new campaigns, pushing police departments to adopt genetic genealogy as a standard tool. Nonprofit organizations raised funds to cover testing for cases where state budgets fell short. Across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, cold case detectives reported a surge in requests from families who now believed their loved ones' files could be revived. Karen Miller, Emma's mother, became a public voice for those families. Standing at vigils and conferences, she repeated the same message. Her dream to help others lives on through every student who earns this scholarship. Her words struck a chord not only with grieving families, but with investigators who felt renewed purpose in their work. Thomas Miller, who had spoken to the press for years during the long silence, addressed the importance of national commentators framed the case as proof that justice has no expiration date, while privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of genealogy databases. Public safety voices emphasized that lives were being saved, killers were being caught, and families were being given closure. The debate sparked across television networks, radio shows, and online forums. In many ways, Emma's case stood at the center of a national dialogue about the balance between privacy rights and public safety. For Lancaster, the trial's end did not erase the pain, but it did close a chapter. Residents no longer whispered Emma's name with uncertainty or fear. They spoke of her as a victim whose story changed the way justice was pursued. For Millersville students, her scholarship became a reminder that determination could outlive tragedy. For detectives across the country, her file became a training ground that showed how technology could break through when traditional methods failed. The larger lesson of the Emma Miller case was clear. Preserving evidence mattered, revisiting old files mattered, and investing in forensic innovation mattered. Each of these elements came together to solve a case once thought unsolvable. Emma's story proved that time did not protect the guilty, and that silence could be broken with persistence and science. By 2023, her name had moved from a cold case file to the pages of national forensic textbooks. Her scholarship fund grew, supported by donors who wanted to honor her. Her memorial stone became a place where families of other victims came to reflect and draw strength. And her parents, though forever marked by loss, carried on her memory with dignity and determination. Emma Miller's story showed the world that justice, even when delayed, is not denied forever. It taught a community, a state, and a nation that truth can still emerge, no matter how much time has passed. Subscribe for more true crime stories where justice, even years later, still finds its way.